At this time, I would like to invite up Tracey Pendley, who is the 2020 Georgia Teacher of the Year. It's a mouthful. Tracey, nice to have you. Thank you.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Tracey Pendley, and I teach fourth grade at Burgess Peterson Academy in Atlanta Public Schools. I've been with the district for 5 years, in education for 17, and in the classroom for 11. I started teaching in Chicago at a turnaround school before coming back here to my native Atlanta. I'm a Grady baby, born and raised here. I bring my sociology background to the classroom, as well as 10 proud years of mentoring student teachers and being a district leader in social emotional learning. I teach because I know that education is key to creating a better and more equitable life chances for our students. And I believe that teaching is the most important job and most collectively powerful job in the entire world. Before I go any further, I'd like to say thank you to you all for being here, but also to the Georgia Partnership. The 7 months since I was named the 2020 Georgia Teacher of the Year has been nothing short of amazing. It's the honor of a lifetime to represent our state's teachers and our students, and to travel sharing my practice across the state. I've gotten to do some really incredible things, including flying in an F-16 fighter jet with the U.S. Air Force's Thunderbirds. And even with that, still, by far the most rewarding part of this job has been the people that I've met, and that includes the incredible men and women with the partnership. So, when you're a teacher living inside your four walls every day with your 20 to 30-something kids, it can feel like it's you and your students, parents, and your colleagues against the world. And something that this role has opened my eyes to is that is simply not true. I've gotten to visit schools and see all types of cheerleaders that I didn't realize public education in Georgia had. We have some truly outstanding advocates on our team. For example, from the Governor's Office of Student Achievement to what we're doing at the DOE, to nonprofits, to our community partners, to researchers, to data analysts. There were just scores and scores of people that I didn't realize were working for teachers and for students in our state. And it's been my great honor to share that with teachers as I travel. Every single individual that I've met, they're not just going to work. They're not just showing up. They are showing up. They are showing up because they want to see Georgia students and community succeed. My goal over the next 10 to 15 minutes is to share with you a few reflections from the 2020 classroom, but also to leave you with a few remarks from our 2021 District Teachers of the Year across the state. So many people talk about the ways that school has changed in the last 10 years, and especially in the last 25 years. And it's true to an extent. Gone are the silent rows and the single students raising their hand and the teacher kind of sitting back in a mostly seated position assigning work. Those days are gone. We're teaching differently now because we know more, we know better about how kids learn. So we're using a lot more interactive strategies. And the one-size-fits-all approach, it just does not work. The core of our work hasn't really changed at all, though. It's still that a successful teacher focuses on student growth, not the test scores. It's just to look at the news and to read what we see on Facebook, you would think that every teacher is just crippled at night thinking about the state test, and that is absolutely not the case. In my classroom, I'm focused on their growth, not that number that we're landing on in particular. A successful teacher also knows that student relationships and engagement are key to a child's success. And one thing that hasn't changed at all is that the kids are still the very best part of my job. Even when I told them that I was coming here this week, they immediately began a long discussion about what jokes I might offer you as an icebreaker, because they always want to take care of me. They had this long discussion of whether they should find a new joke, or maybe we should reuse one that has been successful in the past. And if you want to hear it at the end, I'll definitely share it with you, because they are amazing. In addition to the Georgia milestone gains and the graduation gains that we've made, there are lots of other indicators of success of Georgia education in our state. We're moving in the right direction. As I've traveled, something that has been abundantly clear is that more districts and teachers than ever before are focusing on social emotional learning. Now, when I started teaching, 12, 15 years ago, that was just called morning meeting in elementary schools. But with the increase of mental health issues with our families, the fact that we know more about how home situations impact our students, about how social situations impact our students, that this SEL instruction is absolutely critical. Just like we teach a student to read or teach them how to do arithmetic, it is vital that we're also giving them explicit instruction on how to manage their feelings, how to build relationships, how to make responsible decisions. Also, at the conferences, the district events, and schools that I visit, I've seen a much greater emphasis on educational equity than I have in past years. Districts recognize what the research calls the achievement gap, right? That's that disparity between white students and African Americans in achievement. But I prefer to call it what Beverly Tatum and Gloria Ladson-Billings, two researchers, call it. They call it the education debt, because it's not just a gap. It is something that we owe our students. Every child in our country, every child in our state deserves an equitable education, not equal. And that's something that our districts are starting to realize now. You know, equality is when everyone gets the same thing. Equity is when our kids get what they need to be successful. For educators, learning how to do this means that we are working on our unconscious biases. We're offering classroom instruction that incorporates multiple perspectives. And we're offering instruction that reflects and connects to the students that are actually in front of you. It's no longer appropriate to take out a book of only white English, right, and read it with my students in my classroom today. That book doesn't reflect who they are. It doesn't show them the possibilities for their lives. And so we're looking more and more at culturally relevant pedagogy and teaching the kids that are right there in front of us. It also means that no kids are off the hook. 100% of kids are thinking and learning. We're not making excuses for kids anymore. We're giving them the supports they need and then helping them side by side, getting them to success. In fact, the word assessment itself, I didn't learn this until last year. The word assess, its Latin Greek root means to sit beside. Assessment is not about just test scores. It's that relationship that you have with the person that you're mentoring. It's moving them along in lots of different directions, both academically and behaviorally. Now, to make all of these things happen in the classroom, they need various different supports, and they also need good teachers who stay. Now, I didn't always want to be a teacher myself. The job kind of ended up choosing me. My own story is the story of the impact of great teachers in this state. My mom was a baby of 11 kids, and I have a twin brother. My mom was also a drug addict, in and out of prison, and then later on in and out of the hospital with a lung disease that she developed, COPD, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. And during this time, we lived with 9 different families, and we went to 9 different schools. And when she wasn't in prison, we were taking care of her. We were taking care of her lung disease. I was cooking, I was cleaning, and doing all the things that normal elementary kids don't do. Now, do you think my teachers knew all this? No, we don't know every kid's story. I like to think that I know my students really well because I put that effort into building that relationship. But the truth is, all of these data points that we see, every single one of those has a story. They have a name. They have potential. They have dreams. And they need people like us to stand up for them and to have hard conversations when that's necessary. So I remember there was one pivotal Sunday afternoon when I had to decide that education was the most viable track for me. I only had 2 dresses, and the Sunday school bus would come through, and I kind of altered my dresses. And this one particular Sunday, I was on crutches because I had hurt myself in PE. I was 10 years old. And I got home from church, and my mom said, "Get in the car," and I knew where we were going. She was going to score her next high. Got in the car. Instead of making me wait in the car, this time she said, "I'm going to drop you off at Dairy Queen and give you $2, Tracey." "Okay, Mom. I'll be back in 10 minutes. "Okay." So I get in line, have my crutches, hobble, hobble. I get my ice cream. I go outside. At this point, about 7 minutes or so has passed, and I'm waiting for Mom to pop up so I can walk out there knowing it's going to take me a few extra minutes. She's not there, and she's not there, and there's a really nervous feeling in the pit of my stomach because I know what's going on. The ice cream that I'm holding starts to melt and drip down my hands, and it starts to drip onto the ground and pool. Eventually, someone there called the police, and they came and spoke with me, and they said, I told them that I lived around the corner, and it was okay. They went on about their way. This was 1995. When Mom finally did come back, she put me in the car, and we went right back to where she'd gone before. And it was sitting there in that car in that moment with my hand still sticky from the ice cream that I said, if I'm gonna find a way out of here, if there is another path for me, this woman is not gonna be the one to help me. And so I truly turned to my teachers. And I had the most incredible string of teachers the next several years. They were caretakers. They read books that brought us together as a community. There wasn't a lot of silence. It was engaging. When we learned about colonial days, we were churning butter, sewing rag rugs, and making dolls. When we learned about economics, we didn't just watch a video or read in the textbook. We actually created a classroom business, bought shares into a company. I put in $7.12 that I had scraped together from the bottom of my aunt's purses. And when I got my money back from the business, I had $20.50. I was very, very rich, right? It was amazing. These teachers were incredible. And they went above and beyond outside of the classroom. There was one evening that I was going to present at an art event downtown at the Towers. It was for Georgia welcoming the 1996 Olympics to the world. And when my teacher, Dr. Ford, told me that I had been invited, I went, Dr. Ford, I can't go. My mom doesn't have a car, she's too sick, and we don't have the money to get there. I did not tell her what was also on my mind, that I was afraid of being embarrassed. I was 11, right? We're gonna give me some grace here. Dr. Ford wasn't gonna let that happen. She picked up me and my brother and my mom and took us to Steak and Shake and then down to the Towers for the reception. I felt like a rock star. And then Mom had a panic attack. And selfishly, I went, great. It's all gonna be taken away. This one night that I have to shine. And y'all, Dr. Ford wasn't gonna let that happen either. I don't know where she found it, but that lady went and found an oxygen tank and came right back to give it to my mom. The night was saved. Teachers are incredible. Now, what's interesting is that I didn't immediately want to be a teacher. Now, after my mom, she passed away when I was in 7th grade, and my brother and I were split up for a couple of years. We moved around with different uncles and aunts until finally it came down to it's either this last uncle who you don't know really well or foster care. Well, I don't know about you, but I chose the uncle that I didn't know very well, and it was hands down the best thing that could have ever happened to us. For the very first time in my life, I was in a 2-parent home. There was stability. People went to work every day. We sat down and had dinner together. I had never seen that before. I didn't know it was something that people did. You see, a lot of our job as educators is to open up the possibility and the potential for our students' lives. Now, you would think I definitely want to be a teacher after all that, but it took me running an after-school program throughout my undergrad and then pursuing a doctorate's degree in sociology until I realized that my greatest impact was with those kids because it was those relationships that was really going to drive change in their lives. I realized that my teachers were my lifeline, and they allowed me to see a future where I couldn't carve out a path before. Even more, and this is really important, I realized that unlike so many other children born into the circumstances that I was born into, I was privileged. I had a successful uncle and aunt swoop in and provide a safety net that a lot of kids just don't have. The children that we teach, they're wonderful. What makes teaching the most difficult in 2020? It's not the kids. And it's not what, despite the news says, it's not test scores. It's not that stuff, but rather it centers on the same issues that you heard about this morning. Issues of equity. It's not all of our children being able to come to school ready to learn. It's that 1,000,000-word gap that kids have before they even get to kindergarten. It's not having transportation and affordable housing. It's the cycle of poverty that is repeating itself. When my parents are having a hard time helping their kids with homework because they themselves never learned how to do that algorithm. Not every kid has a successful uncle and aunt to swoop in. I was privileged. In 2018, I published an article looking at school choice and gentrification and the confluence of the two in Atlanta. What I had noticed that as gentrification started a huge uptick around 2000, so too we had the rise of charter schools. Now, I find it to be somewhat of a neat coincidence, but what the research says is that even with progressive families is that when we have incomes moving in together, you can have a neighborhood that's definitely integrated. But what happens is a parallel play situation where our middle-class families, our most privileged families, are choosing those other options, and it leaves our public schools lacking. It is increasing racial segregation in my corner of Atlanta. It's also led to a lot of unaffordable housing and competition that has harmed our public schools rather than helped them. Not long after this book was published, word made it to me of a former student of mine, and I felt the sting very heavily of this issue. David was an amazing student. I was his intervention teacher, but I knew him long before he made it to me because of his bright personality. He was going to be an entrepreneur. He was going to be a lawyer based on the way he could debate with his teachers. And he lived with his grandmother and has a lot of responsibilities. His teachers were his support system. They knew him. He had been there since pre-K in Kirkwood. They took care of him. They knew his family, and they showed up in so many different ways for him. He was that kid that needed the people to really know him, trust him, love him. Imagine my shock and grief last summer when he popped up on the news. David had been arrested for carjacking and credit card theft of an elderly woman 2 days after he turned 16. He's being tried as an adult. The life that his grandmother and that his teachers envisioned for him, at least for the next many, many years, it's over. Equity is one of our greatest issues right now. That is what we're dealing with. And I know that we can change this. We can directly shape it. Teachers have the most incredible job because we get to directly mold students' lives, but it's going to take more than just us. It's going to take all of us to close the education debt and to continue growing Georgia students. If the children are our future, then we better make sure that they're also our today. So what can we do to look at today that will move our teachers and students forward? I posted something online to a group of the 2021 District Teachers of the Year. That's over 150 teachers who won that title for their own district. I asked them that if they could tell the media anything, what they would want you to know. And I received some responses about looking at mental health in schools, but the resounding responses fell into two camps. One was about teacher recruitment and retention. Very similar to what Mr. Woods said earlier, is that recruitment's not the issue. The issue is that we have a leaky bucket. We're pouring teachers into a bucket that's full of holes, and it's just spilling out at the sides. We can fix this bucket, though. We can fix it. Most people assume that teachers get better by learning more with reading, learning more instructional strategies. But the real way that teachers get better is by developing mindsets that help them to persevere. Developing mindsets that allow them to be culturally responsive to our kids. That's how they're going to grow, by developing teachers who take care of themselves, who meditate, who take a moment to sit down and know that that work is still going to be there tomorrow. We can teach our teachers this. And one Atlanta-based residency that I want to draw your attention to is called CREATE. It's called Collaboration and Reflection to Enhance Atlanta Teacher Effectiveness. And this residency has a program with Georgia State, and they put teachers into a classroom for 2 years. In their first year of teaching, they actually have a partner and a myriad of different supports. They learn how to meditate. They have compassion training. They do critical friendships. They travel to social justice conferences. And the coolest part is that this is not just for those new teachers. These programs are provided to every single teacher in that school building that is participating. You want to talk about changing a culture? Let's bring in some new teachers and have our marigold teachers be the one to raise them up. Something else that they mentioned was how bad the public perception is of our awesome, awesome job. One person said, "There is so much more that is going right with our schools and students than is going wrong." And they're so true. But that doesn't always make it to the forefront. It's not always what we see. But together, we can flip the script. Teaching is beautiful, it's personal, it's intellectually and emotionally challenging, and it's absolutely critical. We have to uplift teachers, help attract them, teach them, take care of them, and retain them. There's something that happens in a classroom when it's super, super chaotic. There's a trick that teachers have. So you can have all these things going right, but the chaos can start to rise up. Here's a trick. We'll start narrating what we see going well. I see Emily putting her name on her paper. I see Travis having a seat. I see Michelle using an excellent opening sentence that is detailed. The magic is when I start narrating that, every other kid in the class starts to do it. So I started thinking as I was talking to the District Teachers of the Year, I wonder what would happen if we all began treating teaching that way. I'm not saying that we ignore the negative things, but what would happen if we made it a point to speak highly of teachers, to speak better of our districts, to share the successes of the classroom, to make the article about why we stay go viral instead of the article about why we leave? I wonder what teachers we would attract and what great new seeds would be planted. Teachers would persevere, I'm sure, because of the collective support. I'm sure more people would want to stay. I'm going to leave you with one last comment that one of the teachers shared. If I could tell them one thing, it would be that we feel incredibly thankful to teach in the state of Georgia. We have the greatest jobs in the entire world. We get to wake up and impact lives daily. We work hard each day to meet every child where they are and fill their brains so that they can one day become successful engineers, doctors, pilots, parents, and so on. We work with our peers and collaborate to make engaging lessons that impact our students' lives. We truly love our jobs. That is all I have for you, and I'm happy to take any questions that you may have. Yes?
So what do you think went wrong with David? You were his intervention specialist. You're a proven successful teacher. You had this community of teachers supporting him. So what went wrong?
I think that when he moved, he lost a lot of those supports. He was uprooted. He moved away from family members that also lived right there. The teachers who would pick him up and drive him to the neighboring middle school were no longer there. He lost his supports. You know, and I think a lot about me because even after I had amazing teachers, I still made some mistakes that could have cost me greatly as a teenager. But I had that uncle to swoop in. David didn't have anybody. Anyone else? All right. I certainly appreciate you being here. Thank you.
Thank you, Tracey, for just sharing and being so vulnerable in your reflections. This time we're going to have Meghan Frick come up from the Georgia Department of Education, provide communications update. Welcome, Meghan.
Hello, everyone. Hope your lunch is digesting well. I know most of you know me. If we haven't spoken in person, we have probably spoken over the phone or email. I'd love to put a face with a name if we haven't already. But as I was introduced, I'm the Director of Communications for the Georgia Department of Education. And I'm here to give just a really brief update about how you can connect with us when you need information from the DOE. So really simply, here's where to reach me. I always highlight email because that's usually the easiest way for me to get back to you. Like a lot of us, I use email as my to-do list, but you can also call my desk or my cell, and text messages are fine at that cell number as well. Make sure that you're receiving press releases from the department. If this is not at the bottom of emails that you're getting, are press releases, then you're just on the general mailing list, not the press list. And there are occasionally things like announcements of upcoming release dates that I send to press only. So if you're not on the list at all, please send me a note and let me know. If you are not seeing that they're coming to the press list, let me know so I can get you on the correct list. If you ever need a past press release back about as far as 2011 or so, if you go to our webpage, gadoe.org, this is in the bottom half, right there where it says news, all of those archived releases are linked there. Here's what we can help with at the department, and then things where we'll try to help point you in the right direction. So of course, any questions about Georgia Department of Education policies or policy positions, if you need an interview with a DOE staff member, whether you know who that person is or if you're just wondering if we have someone with expertise in a certain area, let me know and I'll put you in touch. Requests for data or public records housed at DOE. We do have a separate open records officer, but if I have it immediately on hand, I can pass it to you without you having to go through the whole process, or I can put you in touch with them if it's not something that I have already. Source identification in your coverage area. I saw Susan Percy earlier. I'm not sure if she's still here, but I just talked to her this week. She was doing a story on the APEX program for mental health in high schools, and we don't really work directly with that, but I was able to get her in touch with Houston County Schools because they've done a ton of work implementing that program. So if you're looking for someone, a school or a district that is implementing a program that you're covering, we can sometimes put you in touch with someone there. A couple of things that are overseen by other agencies in Georgia, and some of these are actually unique to Georgia, that it's a separate agency. We only oversee K-12 schools. Higher education is overseen by the University System of Georgia and the Technical College System of Georgia. They, of course, each have communications staff who can answer your questions. We do not oversee teacher certification and licensure, so that's the Georgia Professional Standards Commission, which is a separate agency. And then private and independent schools, of course, what makes them private schools is that there's not a government agency that oversees them. Typically, I know that that can sometimes be difficult for y'all, especially if there's a school that has closed or something like that. I'll generally point you to the Georgia Independent Schools Association, which is essentially their accrediting group. So the question I get most often that's not an actual question for an upcoming piece is, when's the next big report? When's the next big data release? And I never have a great answer on this because we typically know a couple days before it comes out what the exact date is going to be. I try to let you guys know as soon as I have that date, and that's another good reason to make sure you're on the press list, not just the general mailing list. But just so you can know when to be on the lookout for various reports that come out through the department, the Financial Efficiency Star Rating comes out in January, so that'll be later this month. AP scores, we don't decide on that release date. That comes from the College Board, but it is almost always in February. Georgia milestones will be mid to late July or early August. Graduation rate, mid to late September or early October. SAT and ACT, again, we don't determine those release dates, but it's typically in September or October. CCRPI in October or November, and then CSI and TSI, so those are our identifications of underperforming schools that need additional state support. It stands for Comprehensive Support and Improvement and Targeted Support and Improvement. We have to have the CCRPI scores to make that calculation, so it comes out pretty much immediately following CCRPI in the next week or so. After CCRPI. A couple of things that I would suggest bookmarking, some of the legislative priorities that Superintendent Woods talked about today. We have all of our 2020 legislative priorities on this website, gadoe.org/legislative, and we're going to try to, if legislation is filed that speaks to those priorities, we're going to try to post updates on that page throughout the session as well. And then I know that many of you have been interested in the standards review for math and English language arts. Anytime there's a presentation on that subject or a report or anything like that, we're we're posting it at gadoe.org/standards. Just so you know the timeline, we're doing a staggered process. We're doing math first and then ELA. So we're targeting the adoption of the math standards in June 2020. So that is all I've got, but I'm happy to answer any questions. All right, well, that's easy enough. Oh, Stanley?
I was just going to see if you could email out the presentation.
Yeah, I'll have them all. I'll make sure to get them to everyone in the room who wants it. Well, I'll just send it to everybody who's on the attendance list.
That's it.
All right, thanks, guys.
All right, thank you, Megan. Now we're going to transition into our afternoon session, and our speaker for the next few minutes will be Dr. Stephen J. Owens from the Georgia Budget and Policy Institute. He's the Senior Education Policy Analyst, and he'll talk about school funding. Steve?
Hello, thank you so much for having me. Fun fact, I think Dr. Pruitt spoke earlier this morning. He was actually a cross-country coach at the high school where I was going to go and left the year before I started there. Like Dr. Pruitt, previously Coach Pruitt, was like a lion in our household. Like he was just such an incredible person. I'm glad to hear that our paths are intersecting again. And just so y'all know, Fayette County influences everything. I was asked to come and speak about what did funding look like for K-12 education for the current year. And so we'll spend a lot of time talking about kind of the current fiscal year we're in and what we could look forward to in the next fiscal year. And just so we're all on the same page, I'm sure you know, fiscal year is the beginning. It starts July 1st. So we are smack dab in the middle of fiscal year 2020, and which we'll be spending most of the time talking about. And I'm a senior education policy analyst at the Georgia Budget and Policy Institute, where our mission is to advance lasting solutions that expand economic opportunity and well-being for all Georgians. And our vision for what that looks like is a fair and inclusive Georgia where all people prosper. And as you can tell by our middle name, we focus primarily on the state budget as a moral document showing kind of the winners and losers of citizens of the state of Georgia. And you can see similar effects in our school system. And we've written about that in the past. To give you some top line looks at what the budget looks like this year, the state line item for K-12 education makes up 41% of all dollars spent of our $28 billion budget. It's easily the largest thing that Georgia spends money on, and that is not uncommon nationwide. That historically, the states, as they were building out their constitutions, recognized that the power for public education was not in the federal constitution and took that as a power on the state level. And so we always look, when it comes to funding, the state is the primary entity for which we hold accountable state, like local funding issues and state funding issues. It is their primary responsibility in Georgia to provide an adequate public education for all citizens. Department of Education is currently operating on a $10.6 billion budget. The vast majority of that, as you know, is flowing down to local school systems. And this budget represents a $700 million increase from this time last year. Not almost entirely, but the large majority of that is because of the teacher pay raises, that $3,000 pay raise that when you add in the raises that go to the Department of Education and to other certified employees, represents about $500 million on its own for teachers and certified employees across the state of Georgia. And so we're going to dive into a little bit of what this looks like. Here's that pie chart of what the state general fund looks like. When you include higher education, it's more than half of every dollar spent by the state is going to education in Georgia. Very recently, we just put it on their website today, published a report called the State of Education Funding. Like, what does that look like right now? And it's easily digestible. At least in the Word document that I put it together, it was about 4 pages. I don't know how our comms team turned it into 10 pages, but it's visual heavy, and it really is just giving you an idea of what it looks like in QBE, that's the Quality Basic Education Act, right now. And I was somewhat delighted to recognize that before austerity cuts took effect in fiscal year 2003, if we use 2002 as a baseline and use that dollar amount and adjust it for inflation, that we are now eclipsing those pre-austerity cuts levels. And that is, the majority of that is getting rid of austerity, but also the teacher pay raises is a big part of that, additional students in different types of school programs, the additional money we put in the teacher's retirement system, all of those things come together to show that we're now we can now put austerity behind us. And we're in year 2, we're hearing the governor signal that this is something that he wants to continue, that QBE has been exempt from any budget cuts that we've heard so far. So this is absolutely good news, that we are kind of beyond those days, that these additional investments now show us above that kind of mark when before we had the $9 billion less from the state for public schools that happened over the years of austerity from fiscal year 2003 to 2018. This past year increases that I mentioned, that $700 million, we broke that down to see what that growth looks like from last year to this. And as I mentioned, $534 million for the $3,000 teacher pay raises and for a couple other pay raises in the 2% amount for different employees is the bulk of that. We're having even less money come up to the state from local 5 mil share, and that's a good sign. That means the property taxes are kind of continuing to rebound from the recession. It means that we're getting less money because this is the amount that isn't coming in because it's staying in the school district for the local 5 mil share. On the other side of that, you can see that equalization grew by $79 million this year. So equalization is the grant that equalizes property tax amounts above that 5 mil share. So without getting a little too wonky, you're required as a district to levy 5 mils of property taxes that goes to public education. But you can levy taxes on top of that. And this becomes a problem because if the state gives every district the same amount of money, $5,000 per student, if you have a district that can levy hundreds of millions of dollars on top of that in property taxes, they're playing on the same playing field as the school district that might not be able to levy any additional taxes because of the burden on their own people, because there might not be that many high property taxes available. So equalization is that way of equalizing the amount of money even on top of what the state gives. And so the lower 50% of school wealth districts receive equalization dollars and absolutely rely on them because they can spend this money on however they see fit. As we see equalization go up, that means that the distance between our high wealth districts and our low wealth districts is getting further. All right, this is something that, again, is a necessary grant built on top of the Quality Basic Education Act. But every time we see equalization goes up, that means that there is kind of a furthering divide between our high wealth districts and our low wealth districts. There's $134 million of additional money for enrollment growth, and I'm looking forward to talking about that. I also dive into that in the State of Education in Georgia funding report that's outside. But this is what this looks like funding year over year. If you've ever been to a budget presentation, the CFO of the Department of Education, Ted Beck, will lay out why the Department of Education is asking for additional money in a lot of different areas. And one that goes somewhat without much fanfare is that idea of increasing enrollment. We all know that the costs increase as we get additional students, but even as now our enrollment in the state of Georgia has remained somewhat steady the past few years, you saw that $134 million of additional expenses, and it's because students are being placed or need additional higher expense programs. So this dotted orange line here is normal enrollment growth from fiscal year 2012 to 2018. Each one of these programs that command more state and local dollars have grown that much higher than just a normal growth. So early intervention, this is the program for students who arrive at the schoolhouse maybe a couple grades behind. It's meant to kind of bring all students up to that grade level. And so if a child is put into an early intervention program for reading or math, they can have a smaller class size, maybe they can have an additional instructor inside their class to provide them help, maybe they can have some more time in the computer lab. But that's additional state money because it requires additional salaries. We've seen the enrollment for early intervention program for K through 5 jump 40% over this like 6-year time frame. You can see remedial education. Side note, we're the only state in the union that still calls it remedial education. We have a remedial education program for middle school that's jumped over 50%. This is not a bad thing. These are additional targeted supports for these students. But anytime you see this kind of talk about like our enrollment growth, even if the number of students hasn't changed that much, usually it's because students are entering into programs that cost more to educate. This only goes through fiscal year 2018, but the CFO mentioned that enrollment in gifted program has increased 50% in the last 5 years. We fund gifted programs in Georgia higher than any other state in the union. So that is something that costs more money even if the number of students remains stagnant, depending on the program that they're in. One of the things that we're gonna kind of continue to hit on as we talk about the budget is transportation funds. I saw that the superintendent put this on a list of priorities for the Department of Education. I'd heard that this is something that in the listening session that the governor had throughout the year, that they heard a lot about, and it's because this dollar amount is becoming very untenable. And depending on the district you talk to, it is already becoming a crisis. We are on pace to spend $1 billion to bus students to and from the schoolhouse this next year. And the amount that's allocated for these schools remains steady at about 150 to 135, plus some bond money for school bus replacement. So school buses are getting more expensive. Parents are expecting, if you can believe it, air conditioning, high-speed cameras, the ability to have a speaker on the bus. If we want to have seat belts on the bus, I mean, these are real costs that come with busing students to and from. And when you talk to school district leaders, like we have a survey that went out this summer, they mentioned that they do not see the budget as a lot of individual buckets that you can then pull down these funding for this. Like if you don't have the money to start your school bus, that's money that has to come from what could have been reading recovery, what could have been, you know, an additional teacher in your kindergarten classes. They have to see this budget as a whole. And this is something we're hearing more and more about, that this budget line item is killing our districts, even when we're in like very incredible economic times. And so we're going to continue to keep a lookout on this. Dual enrollment, as I'm sure you know, is going to be a big discussion because we're seeing those costs increase year after year. Last year, only $100 million was allocated, but it's looking like when we're looking at the enrollment for dual enrollment, it's going to cost more, about $123 million, so there's a gap that will maybe need to be made there. There were a few bills that didn't pass but got a lot of great discussion on what those costs could look like. We did a report at GBPI about dual enrollment, and I've just got to say what we found is that there are essentially 180 different dual enrollment programs across the state because of those unique relationships that districts have with the local institutions of higher education. And it looks completely different. I mean, with two districts that might be right next to each other. That we talked to a counselor in Clayton County, they mentioned that they're running a loss on this program. Even the students that are paid, like the students are financed even if they're not going to be at the school anymore. So the schools continue to be paid for their presence even if they're not there. The college is paid in that tuition, and they're running a loss because of the increased counseling costs, because they're actually using school bus transportation money to get students to and from Clayton State and other institutions of higher education. And there are a few areas in that report where you can see where some cuts could be made, and we're going to be following these sorts of discussions, hoping that if there are cuts, it's done in a way that's equitable. Because one of the surprising things I found is that rural Georgia is making a much larger use of dual enrollment than that 5-county metro area. So the 7 most sparse districts in Georgia, their high schools have about 1 in every 4 students in dual enrollment, while the 5-county metro area, about 5% of their students. I think that's 1 in 20. And so we're seeing just incredible use, and there's also an inverse relationship between the offering of APs and dual enrollment. So if you can't afford AP labs or an AP teacher, or you can't recruit an AP teacher to your part of Georgia, We're seeing that the districts that offer fewer AP tests actually make greater use of dual enrollment. So it's meeting this very specific need in the state of Georgia, and any cuts that kind of come down in order to curb these costs, because the state of Georgia only has one requirement when it goes to session, which is to pass a balanced budget. Just making sure that these cuts happen like equitably and not in a way to hurt, especially rural Georgia that has so few options to kind of increase their educational opportunities as it is. Tax credit vouchers is something that GBPI has had a longstanding opposition against. The cap was raised to $100 million last year. That's enough to pay for 2,200 public school teachers across the state of Georgia. We have no real evaluation of how these students are doing once they enter these private school programs. There's a lot of accountability that could help us understand how this program's operating and if we're getting a good return on investment for tax credits like these. We're going to have a discussion this year about a different type of voucher. So the tax credit voucher is money diverted instead of going into the state general fund. It then goes to tax shelters, which then hopefully go to private schools. A more traditional voucher that we've seen is one like that was proposed last year, educational savings accounts, which is money that's already entered the state general fund. Instead of going to public schools, going to private educational costs. And so this will be a big discussion again this year. There was a talk last year about maybe ESA saving public schools money. And I want to rebut that right here, because if you lose 3 students, even if you're allowed to keep your local funding, if you lose 3 students and the state funding that goes with them, you can't cut 3 seats off of the school bus, you can't fire 1/7 of a teacher, and you can't turn down the heat 3 students amount. These fixed costs absolutely remain, and so as schools kind of continue with just fewer students, the end result is that the remaining 90% of students that were in the state of Georgia that are in Georgia's public schools just have less to be taught with. And so that is something that, especially kind of in rural Georgia, which I've seen as this unique focus in these past couple years, that as they rely on more of state funding for their public schools, this could hurt them even more. So you have smaller class sizes. Losing 1 or 2 students could be really damaging to your ability to budget well. I have heard a lot of discussion about around the idea of increasing funding for students living in poverty. I'm not foolish. I don't believe this is something that's necessarily going to happen this session. I understand that we're having kind of a protracted budget session, but even as this discussion kind of continues, this is an idea that began under Governor Deal's Education Reform Committee. We are one of 8 states that does not have specific funding for students living in poverty. And so that is a way that Georgia needs to kind of revive. Even if we don't do a complete overhaul of the Quality Basic Education Act, we can do small revisions in order to make it more equitable, in order to serve these students well. And the Education Law Center out of New Jersey has a great report on what that could look like, how we could use money that's probably currently sitting in remedial education and early intervention, how we could use that equitably in order to bolster. Because when you talk to school district leaders or teachers, and you ask them like kind of that unique challenge of students, they're going to talk about the effect of poverty on students' educational attainment. And the research backs that up. I can give you, within like 60% accuracy, the SAT score on a kid before they enter kindergarten based on what their parents make. So that's something that is a trend that we want to see die. And by increasing funding specifically for students living in poverty, you can kind of balance the scales to support these students. And kind of continue bringing Georgia into the 21st century as far as education funding. Now, everything I've talked about all assumes that Georgia's budget remains pretty similar and predictable. But if we pass a tax cut this year, everything is up for grabs. This is an analysis that was done this past year by our tax and budget analyst. If the tax rate is lowered to 5.5 from 5.75 where it sits currently, state of Georgia will immediately lose out on $500 million. And the median Georgian will gain $60 a year. So that's $5 a month, about half of your Netflix costs will be paid for, but Georgia will be in a very difficult spot. And considering that we spend the second least per citizen of every other state, this really hamstrings us. And I appreciate hearing voices like Senator Tippins that Georgia does not have a spending problem, we have a collection problem. This would move that much closer to crisis. If we lose out on this additional $550 million a year on this tax cut, then discussions about dual enrollment, discussions about the teacher pay raises, all of this is kind of up in the air if this tax cut is passed. And so I feel compelled to mention that in any presentation I'm giving because it affects every other part up to this point. Got a short list of some reports I've authored in the past 12 months, a few policies that I mentioned here, beyond basic education, 5 ways for Georgia to fund schools fairly. I also authored a report in October of this year about Georgia's Black Belt and how policies that have set this region of the state back, what future policies could look like to serve these students that are in majority student of color districts and majority low wealth districts across the state of Georgia. And then the state of education funding, which is printed out and on the desk. And I printed way too many of them, so take 2 if you'd like. But that is it. Do y'all have any questions? Seeing no questions, I'm just kidding. Yes?
So the tax cut, the 550 you talk about, that'd be 275 out of the FY21 budget, because presumably you would take on Jan 1, 21?
I do not know the answer to that question. My understanding is that the next year the full budget is implemented, so that would be fiscal year 2021, right? That would be, but I would absolutely defer to our.
Because you just cut on January 1 in the middle of a fiscal year. So usually your first year you're only going to lose half the total annual amount.
What would make it implemented January 1?
Because that's how income tax.
Oh, gotcha. So I can absolutely get you that answer, but I don't feel comfortable enough about it to give you a definitive answer on this. Any other questions? Yes.
You may not know this. I'm just wondering, did the tax credit scholarship thing ever hit the cap?
It did in November. Any additional questions? Thank you so much for your time. Look forward to talking to y'all during session.
Thank you, Stephen. All right, so at this time, we're going to transition to our panel, which will be looking at Georgia's future talent pipeline. And as we set up, I'm going to introduce our panelists and our moderator. So our first panelist is Chris Clark, who is with the Georgia Chamber of Commerce. He's the president. We have Honorable Representative Brenda Lopez Romero from the Georgia House of Representatives. We have the Honorable Senator P.K. Martin with the Georgia Senate. And then we have Ms. Errika Moore with the Community Foundation of Greater Atlanta. And I did not introduce them in the order they'll be seated, but they all know where they're sitting, and we will get them going momentarily.
Well, good afternoon, and Robert, thank you so much for the gracious introduction for all of us. Again, my name is Errika Moore, and I serve as the Senior Program Officer for the Community Foundation for Greater Atlanta. And I lead the pillar focused on education, all the way from early education through post-secondary opportunities. So I'm honored to be here, humbled and honored to be here, particularly given the panel that we have and the amazing speakers that will be with you and share with you and share perspective. Also because you've had an afternoon, not just an afternoon, my apologies, a full day, right, of information and content that covers everything from Dr. Dana Rickman at the morning, giving you the top 10 issues to watch in 2020, which included everything from shifting demographics to literacy to early education to principal leadership, which also Dr. Bussey had an opportunity to speak on from GLSEE. So obviously there's been a lot of connectivity in the content that's been presented. But one of the things that we wanted to talk about specifically in this particular panel was also pathways, right? Particularly the post-secondary pathways and discussing what does that look like for the state of Georgia. So, and particularly as you heard from Dr. Pruitt, right, as he provided the reminder of one, just some of those essentials that he said and he mentioned in terms of if we're looking at pathways, everything from career readiness in the academia and making sure that there's alignment, beginning at middle school ages, recognizing that that's not something that we can begin in high school, but in middle school, there needs to be a starting point even as early as that to plant the seed and to prepare students. Aligning the stages of learning and even how that we're ensuring that education is leading to a true future. It's not just walking away with a diploma, as Superintendent Woods mentioned, but actually leading to a true full-on future, right? So as we look at and pay attention to pathways, one of the questions that I definitely wanted to begin in asking the panel, when Dr. Pruitt mentioned, right, when he gave the projection for 2030, and he said that by 2030, without state and business leaders taking action, 1.5 million workers in Georgia and their children could be unemployable or stuck in low-wage jobs. An endless cycle of poverty. What thoughts do you have? That's a big question. That's a big statement. And oh, by the way, he also stated, for those who weren't here, that we would probably double the percent of young adults, or the goal, right, is to double the percent of young adults who earn post-secondary credentials by the age of 25 in the next decade. Those are two big statements. So let's open up with big statements. And what are your thoughts? All three, please. All three of you. Absolutely.
Thank you very much. First of all, thank you for having me. I appreciate being here. Thanks so much to what the Georgia Partnership does for education. And it's been very helpful for me after my first year of as Education and Youth Chairman in the Senate. And I appreciate the work that they do. So thank you so much. And she already left, and it's so sad. I wish we could have given a round of applause to the Teacher of the Year. She was just fantastic. Her stories were amazing. I sent a text to one of my press friends, hashtag presser people too. And I know that you were probably moved by that because it was a really amazing, amazing story that she has to share. And I look forward to hearing more from her at possibly at a Senate Education and Youth meeting. I think that'd be very helpful to hear that piece. So just, I think when you look at those numbers, I think that the SREB is correct and that our economy is changing. I think if we don't change the economic system to line up with those changes, then yeah, children are going to be left behind. One good thing we have going is, especially for our adult learners that are being left behind at times, our TCSG does an amazing job of helping adults make those adjustments, learn new skills to be able to take hold of these new jobs that are available. So that's a good thing and it's a positive thing. We have to do a better job of telling people about it. We have to make sure people know the opportunities are there. We can't keep doing things the same way. I think we have to innovate. We have to innovate to engage with today's students. I think that Lindsay, I think that she kind of reached to that. You have to reach today's students. We have to expose them to trades that match up with their talents. We have to improve the K-12 to college pathways. We have to be able to get these kids so they have an idea of where they're going and why. So I'm going to post-secondary, but why am I going there? What is the purpose for me there? And I think we have to continue to look for ways. We have to invest in teachers. We have to invest in school districts that need a little extra help. And then we have to keep looking for ways to prepare these kids for the jobs that are out there, the new jobs that are out there. So as long as I'm chair of education, we're going to continue to look for those policy ideas, new policy ideas, to improve the student outcomes. To me, it doesn't matter, and I may have stepped on a few toes along the way. I try to be at least kind and gentle about it when I do it. But I think that the students are too important, and I think sometimes as we're making changes, as we try to do things better, that we have to do that along the way. If we don't innovate, I think our communities and families are going to suffer. So what have we done? We've done some things to kind of help. I think we have worked on trades and focusing on that in the last few years. Last year, we passed a computer science requirement, which I think is going to be, it's going to pay off great dividends to the state of Georgia, especially when you look at the new jobs that are coming available moving forward. I'm aware that that's going to be difficult for a lot of school districts. We put in the bill some extra time to make sure that they have time to meet these requirements, and also we put some money in the budget last year to help with the training that they're going to need. And as far as I'm concerned, we're going to keep up with that help. We have to do that to make sure that we help teachers and help districts attain this. We have to keep looking for ways to incentivize teachers. We have to make sure that they stay in the profession, that we're keeping our quality teachers. We have to do everything we can to fight the burnout. Similar to the way we did by passing the pay raise last year, I think that has done a lot of good. I think we also have to continue to work with students. I had to put a comma here. We have to work with students that it doesn't come easy for. So the students that it's difficult. And I think we took a step in the right direction last year with the dyslexia bill. I learned in the committee meetings that just because it's hard for a student, just because early elementary, just because literacy is difficult, it doesn't mean they don't have talents. These kids are very smart, they're intelligent, and we have to work extra hard to make sure they're getting the interventions that they need to unlock their potential so that they can really go after their dreams. Then I have to turn a page. I flew to Europe. I got back Wednesday, so I had to make sure that I have some notes here because I didn't want to just, you're all press. So got to make sure I'm saying what I intend to say. Again, the dyslexia law is not easy either. I know it's not easy. I tell you what's exciting though, talking to the Department of Education, schools have literally been knocking on their door to participate in the pilot. And so to see that excitement within the education community to take part of this and to try to be the district that is leading on this, I think that's very exciting, and that's going to pose well. My phone is ringing off the hook in my pocket. I apologize. I wanted to make sure we did this right. There were some of the advocates that were a little concerned about the longer rollout period for this legislation. And I understood what they were saying. Again, like I said, we have to step on toes. I tried to be an equal opportunity toe stepper this past session, but I think it's important that we get it right. We have to make sure that when we unroll this, that nothing worse could happen than for us to try to do this statewide right off the bat and get it terribly wrong and it just be not serve students. So I'm excited that we're taking it a little slow, that we're going to try to make sure we're developing best practices so we can make any changes that we may need to make as we move forward. And then just to say this, as chair, I do remain focused on our committee environment being a place where we can talk about any idea that's meant to give students a better opportunity. Anything that's brought up before us, that we can have those discussions, that we can talk about it. I said that in my first committee meeting last year. I remain resolved to be that way. Any senator that has an idea that's well-intended, that in their mind will help students, let's have the discussions, let's have the talks. When we're talking amongst ourselves, when we're bouncing ideas off of each other, that's when we can find, I think we can find common ground that's going to allow students to be better served in Georgia. So I know there's not one silver bullet, there's not an overnight solution, but we do have to continue to reach out and engage with our students. I love it when I see a spark in a young mind, when you just see it, you see that they get it, or you see something they're excited about. There's nothing better than seeing that. And I think we just have to continue to work to empower our teachers to try to spark those young minds individually. And I think when you do that, then you start creating these moments in kids' lives where they can break the cycle of poverty that exists.
Well, thank you very much, Senator Martin. We definitely appreciate the well thought out just perspective that you've provided, and we also appreciate the leadership that you've provided this past year on some of the bills that have passed in legislation. But Representative Lopez, Romero, and Chris, definitely, I'm sure these statements resonate with you also, so I want to make sure that we give you an opportunity to respond as well, please.
Absolutely. Well, again, thank you so much also for having me here today. And one of the reasons that I chose as my top choice to be on the education committee, and I was placed on the education committee because this is really personal to me. Both of my parents have less than an elementary school education, and my father, in fact, didn't learn how to write or read in Spanish until he was an adult person himself. And so to be what I think is less than a generation, to be able to go to college and then law school, I went to those underfunded, overcrowded schools. Primarily, all my K through 12 education was in DeKalb County, off the Beaufort Highway area. I was the student that moved about 5-6 different times during different elementary school, since we were always looking for more affordable housing. And so. So all of these things, and what was spoken by the Teacher of the Years is very relevant to me, that the problem here is not the students or the inability of the student to do well, but rather, again, systematically, the issues that they face both at home, the non-academic barriers, and also what we need to do to equalize. And what she said about the importance and value of having equity, both in funding and services and programs provided, is absolutely vital, because there are different needs for different areas, both on the issue of income inequality, but also even in the dispersed differences that we have within our metro areas, our suburban areas, and our rural areas. And so one of the things that brings to mind when I heard that, or when I read that statement, was, one of the things that we keep highlighting, and we have been highlighting in our state for the last, 5-6 years, about being the #1 state to do business, which is absolutely vital and important that we keep holding and being a state that welcomes businesses. But we have to look beyond, that cliche to say, what does that mean to the average Georgian, particularly for those that have less access to higher paying jobs? And are we bringing the type of businesses that are going to provide good paying jobs with high skills, and providing the high skills necessary for our local, our homegrown Georgians to actually be able to thrive and go into these businesses, into these levels of careers. I say that because, sort of as an anecdote, I'm in the current 2020 Leadership Atlanta class, and very interesting, we were having a presentation by a person from APS, and basically asked, there was a group of about 50-ish or so people, and said, how many of y'all have been here less than 5 years? And so we had a pretty good handful of people raise their hands, and then, how many of you all have been here less than 10 years? And the vast majority of the people in my cohort raised their hands. And their point was very important to what we're discussing today. When we talk about the growth that we've had economically, and also how we've been thriving from businesses, and how we've been thriving in some of the higher paying jobs, we are not necessarily allocating those jobs to people that have been in Georgia, grew up in Georgia, or were born in Georgia. And so it's vital that we make that distinction when we're talking about what looks like good statistics or good things to say about where we're heading with our state, whether that's actually impacting homegrown, born or raised Georgians, and if we're having those equitable distributions of those resources and those economic factors for everyone here in the state. And so that being said, all of the education issues that we always discuss have to go hand in hand with our discussions with what we had talked about, the non-economic barriers, right? Why this session is going to be very important about where these tax cuts may be done, or actually we should reframe the question about why these tax cuts should not happen. The additional 6% over the 4% that was already done across the board. I've said this for several years. We have the need to really, quite frankly, repeal a lot of the tax credits, general tax credits, right? That we have really no way of knowing that we're getting a return on our investment for a lot of these tax credits. And one of them that comes to mind that I was really upset, I think this was during my second legislative session, the yacht tax credit bill. For those in the media, I think that's what the headline read it as. Again, are these industries that, quite frankly, need these tax credit when they're being profitable, when we're not sort of establishing a new industry in our state? We really have to take a look at whether, again, are we getting a return on our investment from businesses by providing these tax credits, in addition to the fact that we do not and we cannot afford an additional tax rate reduction. Whatever drops that we've now seen this year on revenue is not a crisis in the sense that the economy might necessarily not be doing well, but rather this is self-inflicted in itself caused. And so, you know, we can't then exacerbate the problem by additional tax cuts. And of course, you know, we have to continue to work on the legislative side to not continue both, again, on the repeal side, but also not continue any additional vouchers, as was stated in some of the presentations that we heard before. We have to understand the link between the need for all the services and programmings that are highly important, particularly to the most vulnerable, whether or not they are under the education category, but absolutely vital if we're actually going to have the workforce that we need by 2030, and that we don't continue necessarily to be the #1 state to do business in when we're doing so, again, by being underemployed and underskilled in the jobs and the type of jobs that are coming to our state.
My turn?
Yes.
Thanks, Ms. Errika.
Please.
Ooh, okay, so I'm not the politician, so, but I am proud to be up here with both of you. This issue of education is personal for me. I have a 13-year-old public school, middle schooler right now, and so when we look at these statistics and we hear these numbers, I internalize it, so it becomes personal for, is my son going to be successful? What do we need to do? So let me share a few statistics that drive what we focus on from a business perspective. Over the next 10 years, the United States will lose 30 million jobs to AI. Artificial intelligence will take away 30 million jobs that exist today. At the same time, in the next 5 years, 1 million Georgians will retire. I call it the gray tsunami, right? The boomers are headed for the mountains, or they're headed for the coast. Right, Steve? And so we're going to have those job openings on top of losing these other jobs. And then on top of that, we have to look at between now and 2030, when this cohort of Zoomers really fully enter the job market, 65% of those jobs of the future that will be available in 2030 don't exist today. So we're training kids for jobs that are going away in these 30 million, and we're not preparing them for the jobs that are going to come that we don't even know what they are yet. But we do know that anywhere from 60 to 80%, depending upon which researcher you read today, tells you that they will need some type of credentialing, whether that's a technical college degree, 4-year degree, something more than just K through 12. So that's our focus, is how do we make those kids better prepared for college and career? If you look at Georgia today, only 36% of those in the workforce have some type of credential. 36%. Now, if you're blessed enough to live in Atlanta, your odds are better, right? You're probably around 49% having a credential. But when you get in the car with me and we drive to South Georgia, only 25% of those men and women working in rural Georgia today are credentialed. And so what do we do? How do we improve this pipeline so that we have better success? These young men and women are going to go to school, get the skills they need so that they can figure out whatever those 65% of jobs are, they can be successful. And so for us, and I'm going to jump ahead here, Errika, if it's okay, because I really want to talk about this, and I know we're short on time today. But we've been working now with a coalition called the Smart Decisions Coalition, and Chairman, you had our last meeting the other day, and we appreciate your leadership on it. But our whole purpose this last year has been, what are those really basic, easy things that we can do to improve that? And so I'm not going to give you the whole report today because it's going to come out in a few weeks, and I'd like everybody in the press to do it at that time and cover it. But here's a little sneak peek. Right now, particularly for our rural students, only 37% of our rural students take the SAT or ACT, 37%. Statewide, we're at 70%. We need more kids to take those classes, and so we're going to be working with the General Assembly this year on setting aside a day during the year to take the ACT and SAT. Instead of having to come in on a weekend or travel, my son took it last year. We had to drive 30 minutes to another community. It took up a Saturday. We couldn't play soccer that day. And so we think if you want to help those kids, let's get them in during the year in a regular class setting, and let's get them to take the test, number one. Number two, we have to improve the counseling that we give these young men and women. The average Georgia kid today only gets 20 minutes a year in career or college counseling. 20 minutes a year to figure out what the hell you're supposed to do for the rest of your life. I don't know about you, I need a little more time than that. I still need time helping to figure that out. And so we're going to support, and I hope the General Assembly works on it over the next 2 years, of improving funding for counselors so we can increase the number of counselors, career counselors that are out there. Number three, one of the critical issues that we have are kids just not having the resources, Brenda, to your point, to go to school, to have the same access that many of us in the room have had. And Georgia last year left $82 million on the table in federal Pell Grants. $82 million that could have gone to Georgia kids to help them get through school, we left because we didn't fill out the forms. And so changing how we get kids to fill out the FAFSA forms, we think is incredibly important. And the last issue that we're finding, particularly with first-generation college students, low-income college students, is this last mile. The fact that, the state's spending $150,000 to help me get into college and be prepared, but I can't make rent. How am I supposed to finish up school? And so you look at Georgia State and the grants that they're doing, they're averaging $900 to keep a kid in school. And what we know is if you drop out of college in Georgia because of a financial issue, only 30% of you are going to come back and finish your degree. So because of that $900, we're going to lose 70% of kids that need those credentials to be successful for those jobs that we are going to recruit to Georgia, and they are going to be good paying jobs. And so having that last mile grant at all of our schools is critical. And so we're going to have more of that coming out, but when we talk about these statistics, Errika, when we talk about where we're going, those are some really simple, basic, easy things we can do that can make a difference in every kid's life in Georgia, including my own.
Well, thank you, Chris. And yes, now I'll have to ask you a different question on the other side of all of this, but I thank you for sharing that in advance. Absolutely. So, Senator Martin, again, thank you for your leadership this past year, and particularly you mentioned like Senate Bill 108, which I personally appreciate as someone who sat on the policy committee working with the DOE and the CS for Georgia committee and co-authoring some of that content, right? And you championed that, you led that, and ensured that it came to fruition, and we were very appreciative of the governor signing off on that, as well as like the rural broadband bill, and the dyslexia bill that you mentioned, right? So all leadership opportunities in terms of bringing forward opportunities and access and equitable access for our students throughout the state of Georgia. So as you mentioned, right, you chair the Senate Education and Youth Committee. And as we talk about workforce needs, as we talk about where we sit, as we talk about the state of our education community, and what are other opportunities that perhaps you see coming out of legislation this year, right? I mean, if all that's already happened, what's still available, or what's on the horizon, and even what may be some of the challenges, some other toes that may be stepped on to bring some things to fruition this year?
Less this year.
Much
less this
year. We'll see, okay.
No, I talked to, Ty and I we had a conversation a few weeks about kind of that same question, what's coming? I think that last year, we did a lot of good things. I think also, though, sometimes, as I kind of mentioned in my earlier, these are some big ideas that are not necessarily simple to implement. And so I know there's a lot of frustrations. I have a Gwinnett County education roundtable, and it's made up of parents, it's made up of teachers, it's made up of administrators, like district level and school level administrators. And I know one of the frustrations that was, not every person, but a lot of particularly the administrators say is, hey, what's frustrating is when we get something and we work on it and we get ready to implement it, and then it's time to implement it, and then suddenly the goalposts move. That puts them in a tough situation. So both of those, the dyslexia and the computer science, both have multi-year rollouts. I'm not saying that nothing's going to happen. There are going to be some things that have been discussed, and I'll talk about them. But as far as seeing some really large policy changes or vision type policy bills come out, I don't know that we're going to see anything. You never know, right? I mean, things happen, right? We're here for 40 days, and you just don't know. But honestly, what I've seen is that I don't foresee anything big like those coming up. Now, what is going to come up that I think we will? I think the biggest issue this year is going to be on funding. For the right when Governor Kemp mentioned that, hey, we're going to have the cuts for this current, we're going to hold some money back. The first thing I did was make a meeting, schedule a meeting with his staff and say, hey, we have to preserve QBE funding. We can't, that can't be cut. and immediately started making those decisions. And so I'm fairly certain that everything I've heard is that will be maintained, and I hope that that's real, and I will fight to make sure that that QBE funding is maintained. I think we also have to do as much as we can to maintain as much system support that comes from the DOT as well. That's the fear, though, right? But a lot of these districts need that extra help that comes from the department, and what if we're having to cut those programs as well? And that's the fear. So I want us to make sure we keep as much. Now, I think that it's always a good idea to look at everything we're doing. I think that from talking to the department, they've kind of looked at every program. We don't need to continue funding programs that aren't paying dividends, that aren't being successful. But I think we should double down on the programs that are working. So I think that's the first thing. That's the big issue. Another complaint I've heard, and I know that Tracey, as I checked her name, who was talking earlier, she said she doesn't teach the test, and the tests don't scare her, and that's awesome. I think that's one of the reasons why she's Teacher of the Year. I think that the high-stake tests do cause a lot of stress, I think, in students, in teachers, in administrators even. And that was, when I talked about my committee, that was the one item that came up in almost every single response. What are we doing well? What's our biggest problem? The testing was always there at some level. So I would look to see some sort of legislation that will reduce the number of state-mandated testing, standardized testing and high-stakes testing that's there. And then I think that there have been some preliminary conversations to talk about how the Georgia Code deals with apprenticeships to try to help people, whether they're students or even young adults, pursue careers in other ways, to give them multiple avenues for that. And like I said, there definitely could be some other issues. I think dual enrollment was mentioned earlier. I think we'll work on that as well as we move forward.
Thank you. Thank you. Representative Lopez, Romero, as you mentioned, you serve on the House Education Committee, but you also mentioned you made some very poignant points, right, in terms of my phrasing, being authentic, basically, in terms of how we're identifying. We establish that we are a highly attractive state for new business, but what are we doing with that? How are we really representing ourselves in that? How are we ensuring that there are good paying jobs available, that we're focused on homegrown talent as a result of that, or as we engage in that? How are we using tax credits, linkages to our very vulnerable populations? So again, that's Errika's phraseology about if we have all those things on the table, then how are we being authentic when we state that, right, about ourselves as a state and put that laurel out there? So in that vein, and as you serve on the Education Committee, is there anything from your lens, perhaps, that you see or that you would like to see in terms of opportunities, in terms of making a difference, particularly in the places and in the statements that you made? Are there any opportunities there that you would love to pursue or might be in the future?
Absolutely. So there's actually one of the bills that I want to highlight that's pending. It's HB 414, and it would basically require our kindergarten is actually not mandatory. Vast majority of metro area, it's part of the process. But if you are out in more low-income areas or rural areas, that's not the case. So definitely making that mandatory at the kindergarten level. But I actually think one of the things that I'd like to see, maybe something to work on going forward, would be also the mandatory pre-K, as we were mentioning, to make sure that there's quality pre-K across the board. And the other things that I wanted to discuss also, and these are some of these are ideas, and some of them are bills that are potentially going to be filed later on during the session, that, as we talked about, equitably looking at all of our diverse students. And one of the ways that the SREB report started was with how our state has diversified. And we continue to actually ban certain undocumented students from going to, now it only has gone down to University of Georgia and Georgia Tech being the two universities that outright ban students, regardless of the fact that they were raised in the state, graduated from a Georgia high school to still not be able to attend, and then you have other students that are either undocumented or DACA recipients that continue to have to pay out-of-state tuition, again, regardless of the fact that this is their home and they've grown up here and gone through, many of them, most of our K through 12 education system. So we need to continue to work on providing in-state tuition regardless of immigration status. We also need to continue to work on potentially having tuition-free, particularly up to at least 2 years on our associate program, technical programs, as we were mentioning, particularly if we're going to focus on reskilling or upskilling adults. And I think that that's vitally important. One of the main constraints, particularly for lower skill or what's considered lower skill individuals, is the barrier of affordability to go even into some of the technical programming. That obviously gets correlated to something that's really important in a bill that has been pending for several sessions now, is raising the minimum wage, particularly to $15 an hour. Again, you can't have good, prosperous consumers to be able to increase our ability to consume and pay for the myriad of different services that businesses can provide if they aren't able to actually afford those services. In addition to that, one of the things that wasn't discussed and has always been kind of in a discussion that needs to be done is reformulating the QBE formula. Obviously, it's very outdated, having been established in the early 80s. Obviously, that is not how we can actually account for the needs of students, and that includes obviously making the formula more equitable to based on the needs of each student rather than just across the board. The other thing that I wanted to highlight, that I think that's something that I'm personally kind of doing some research on, and that we see in a lot of our schools in Gwinnett County have dual language immersion programs, right, from starting mostly from kindergarten. But the fact is, if we want to be a state that's going to have some relevance in 2030, particularly not only competing nationally but internationally, we must have bilingual individuals with multiple different types of languages being taught. So I had the privileged to be able to tour around Obama Elementary in the APS system, and it was really great to be able to see that the Spanish language bilingual program that they have there. Like I said, in addition to the fact that Gwinnett has some mostly for Spanish, one for French, and then we have a Korean language dual program. And I think that that's something that we need to do statewide, not just isolated to some of the elementaries here and there that might bring it. It's absolutely vital, and it also cuts away from the conversation we had before about the fact that our state is much more diverse and that our education issues need to focus on uplifting particularly brown and black students in our communities and low-income students generally. That one of the things that I heard even myself growing up, and I was told myself growing up not to speak Spanish, when ultimately it's a marketable skill, right? That's absolutely necessary. And one thing that I've even heard even from some of our folks in our school system in Gwinnett specifically is that our students, our young folks, my own nieces and nephews have consistently in 2019, we're told still that there's a problem when a student comes in having only spoken another language at home, when in fact it is actually proven, study after study, that a kid that has early dual language or bilingual education from the home and from school ultimately does cognitively better in their school as they progress through their school education. So that's definitely something that we need to work on if we're going to be a relevant state in 2030.
Thank you very much. Chris, thank you again for first sharing some of the barriers that are being addressed by the Smart Decisions Coalition, and for just the thought leadership that's happening there and that you're leading through the chamber, because we know that the Georgia Chamber is leading that effort and leading that team. With some of the other things that have been stated, though, today, throughout the day, and just even within the panel, within the past few minutes, around dual enrollment, around apprenticeships, around ensuring clear pathways, career pathways. Even Dr. Pruitt shared during his presentation when he mentioned, when he called out a very specific pathway, a nursing pathway, he talked about the interdependency with business. He specifically identified how it was crucial for Wellstar to be a part of that team and bringing that to fruition. So, in leading the Georgia Chamber, what would you say, what's the response from the business community? What's their level of engagement? How do they see their level of commitment to bringing and being a part of the plan and the solution as we focus on workforce development?
Sure, so we try to hit all three of those real quickly.
However you want to mix it up, yes.
As far as pathways go, the Georgia Chamber led that effort with, I think we had 2,000 HR professionals that gave input to that first round, and that goes back, gosh, almost 6-7 years ago now. And so the business community has been committed to those pathways. We're all in. We'll do whatever to give the skill sets. What you see in a lot of school districts is actually the local business that's paying for the training for those teachers, bringing in the equipment, taking those kids out, spending their own dollars to get that training. There's more of that needs to be done. But I think if local school boards will engage and look at really where the jobs of the future are for their community, those businesses are willing to engage, without a doubt, because they're looking long-term. They're looking at 1 million baby boomers walking off the floor. How do I fill those jobs? What's the pipeline look like? So on the first piece, on pathways, we're all in 100%. On apprenticeships, what I hear from the business community is it's one of the most confusing things in state government. They want to do apprenticeships. The costs sometimes are prohibitive. I think the last time we looked at it, there were 5 to 6 different state apprenticeship programs. 3 of them were under different state agencies. There's no central clearinghouse, easy place to go figure out this apprenticeship program will work easy for my company. Let's make it easy. And so I do think there's a user issue there, and the state could do a lot better job to streamline that program. And also what we're seeing are more local chambers are working with business to develop internships for high school students. In Fayette County, there's 3 different tracks you can take for internships, but then you go one county over and there's no internships. And so I think the state could help show communities how to do that, make it easy for them, and give them something already kind of laid out for them to go implement. The third thing is on dual enrollment, and the Georgia Chamber supported dual enrollment from the first time, the Move On When Ready, because what we realize is not every kid learns the same way. Some are ready to go, some need more remediation. What I've seen over the last couple of years, or particularly in our previous speaker said it, dual enrollment means a lot in those rural communities. Only 29% of our rural students in Georgia have access to an AP class. 29%. And so where else are they supposed to go to get college ready if we're not giving them that opportunity? So dual enrollment becomes their AP class. There's no other option for them. Quick aside, I gave, 2 years ago, I was doing the commencement speech at South Georgia College, and the young man who was graduating with an associate's degree, he was the valedictorian at that, because it was a 2-year commencement associate's program. I talked to him for a moment, because he was very young. He seemed much younger than every other college student there. And he goes, well, yes, sir, I'm graduating today with my associate's degree, and tomorrow I graduate from high school. He's valedictorian of both. That's what that program should be for, is to give those kids that are ready to go that jump start. I do realize there are problems with it. I think there's 2 real simple things we can do from a policy standpoint to make dual enrollment better. One is to ensure that every class that's offered in dual enrollment is transferable. Right now, too many kids are taking classes they can't transfer somewhere else, and so they've locked themselves in. We've wasted state resources. They've wasted their resources. The second is you should only be able to take those dual enrollment classes for core classes. I keep hearing from folks that their kids are taking this class and this class and this class to try it out. Well, that doesn't help the system. The system's not built that way. What we ought to be doing is focus those kids of graduating high school with that associate's degree so they get their master's within 4 years when they get to school, do the double dog, do those other programs out there, and let's not waste resources. And
Georgia Tech.
Or Georgia Tech.
Or Georgia State.
Wow. Just as an example. And so, but the business community wants to be engaged. We will be engaged in those debates, but I don't want us to see moving away, and I particularly don't want to do anything that's going to hurt our opportunity to help rural kids compete, just like we help kids in the suburbs and kids here in Atlanta.
Thank you. Thank you. And I do have to say, go Jackets. I'm sorry. But obviously, so thank you all. Thank you so much for your thought leadership and for sharing your perspective. Obviously, GPE wants to ensure that you all have an opportunity to ask questions as well. So before we get the hook and before we get the signage that says we have to shut everything down, we do want to open up, to hit pause and give you an opportunity to ask any questions that you might have.
I would direct this probably at Chris, but the issue of, I was interviewing the folks from Georgetown Center for Workforce and Education, and they made the point to me that the states think that they can re-educate older workers, but the director of research there said to me, imagine if you found out that your career was over, and you had to reinvent yourself, go back to school for a job that may or may not last. And he talked about the fact that states have to address those fears, that a 45 or 50-year-old worker in rural Georgia, they may just want to stay home. So how do we address that, make re-education not threatening, and get, sort of open those doors?
So I think there's two parts to that. One is we have to really have a fundamental change of the education system in Georgia. We're not built for lifelong learning. These kids today are going to need to update their skills every year to 18 months going forward because that's how fast the economy is going to change. So if we had a lifelong learning system, it would be easy to come in and out and you'd be used to it. So I think it's going to be easier for those students 20 or 30 years from now if we can get the right policies in place now. For those older students, yes, you got to make it cheap, easy. We're seeing communities where they're actually doing training. The technical colleges are going into places like the churches because it's easier. I feel more safe and comfortable getting re-educated there maybe than having to go in with a bunch of 20-year-olds. I think that's an issue. The other thing too is that we see is there's a high rate of entrepreneurship of those people that are displaced later in life. But we don't have a good ecosystem, particularly in the rural communities in Georgia, of where can I go to get the skills to start my own business. If I can't afford to go to the technical college, and that's why I love like the program in Warner Robins, where there's a maker space there in the College and Career Academy. The kids get it in the day, they learn those skills. At night, they open it up for those older workers to come in. And so I think we have to think broader about the lifelong learning component, which you guys are going to have to help lead on. And then the other part is how do you help them have new careers and look at those other kind of skills.
Yes, ma'am.
I'd like to address the comments you made, Mr. Clark, about dual enrollment only being for core courses. Sometimes you have a student who has a pathway or a desire to go in a certain direction and has consumed everything in the local school. So they've consumed the core at the local school that has to offer, and they want to use dual enrollment to extend their pre-college enrollment to higher level courses. I'm thinking of schools that don't have higher level maths, sure. And the child might want to take it. Those are not core courses. So I would feel far more comfortable if you would think about stating that to not take courses that are outside of their chosen career path or something like that. So allow those higher achieving kids to be able to dual enrollment at the junior and senior level, above and beyond what is offered at the...
Right, maybe the term is non-electives. Is that the better term? But listen, also, and we had this conversation yesterday, if my son wants to take some of those other classes too, I can pay for those. It's what's the impact going to be on the local school system that is concerned as well, and what the impact is going to be on the college as well. But I hear you, and I will definitely pursue that, have that discussion.
And I think you also may have meant college core courses. Right. So we're talking about courses that are maybe affect every student as they're entering into their collegiate career, rather than taking some elective that they're trying out, as you made the example. So you're trying out an elective, and then you say, yeah, I'm not going to be a, well, I could use me for an example, since I changed my major about 4 times at Georgia Tech. But I'm not going to be a chemical engineer. But if you have a student who's taking chemical engineering classes, and then they decide to go and be a international affairs major, again, using my own personal experience here, that may or may not transfer. Maybe it transfers as an elective, but I think the idea, and tell me if I'm wrong, we're talking about, when we're as a state investing in these students and trying to help them succeed at the college level, when they come out of their dual enrollment, let's make sure all of those classes are classes that are going to count towards their eventual graduation to help them move along. I don't think we're talking about core classes at the high school level. We're talking about collegiate core classes.
And I had assumed that you were talking about high school courses.
Any other questions? Well, you gave
Much
them,
easier than Steve said.
and you gave them a wealth of information. Absolutely. Well, thank you, please, to our three panelists. Again, Senator Martin, Representative Lopez, Romero, and Chris Clark. Thank you all. Thank you for your time.
Just two things real quickly as we're wrapping up. The first thing is we love your feedback on this. Robert appreciates that every year. It helps us become a little bit better. On the back of your agenda is a code. You can lock on that with your phone. Or if you'd like to have a hard copy, Lisa has some hard copy evaluation forms. But please fill one of those out before you leave. We can have that feedback. So the 15th annual Media Symposium could be even a little bit better. Second thing is thank you for being here today, but let's not let this be the end. Please use us as a resource. If you call Robert, he will grab Dana or me, or sometimes we both tag team to chat with you about background or specific information you need for any article that you're doing. So let us be a resource. And with that, thank you very much for being with us all day.